Welcome to American Muse podcast, where we explore hidden secrets in the landscape of 19th and 20th century American orchestral music. Your host is Dr. Grant Gilman, conductor, violinist, and author based in Atlanta, Georgia. In each episode, Grant unearths a fresh orchestral work by an American composer you may not even know. And by the end, we hope you are a new fan of the composer and their music. Now, your host, Maestro Grant Gilman.
So, our guest today on American Muse is Director of Orchestras at Washburn University, international guest conductor, former Army captain and current conductor of the 44th Army Band, music director of the Colorado Pops Orchestra, composer, arranger, and cat lover. You can find him all over social media, along with his new interview video podcast, Coffee with Maestro. Please welcome Maestro Silas Huff.
Very nice to be here. Thanks for asking me.
No problem. You're coming to us from...
I'm in Lawrence, Kansas at the moment, which is where I've lived for about a year.
Yeah. So you're now in your second year as director of Orchestras of Washburn in Kansas, and the first year as full-time now, correct?
That's right. Yeah, last year I was the visiting professor, and I was sort of hoping to win the permanent position, and I did, and it starts in 5 days. I'm not sure when your viewers will see this, but for me, it starts in 5 days. And so in the spring, I was really excited about this fall. And now it looks a little bit different.
Right. So besides that, you had a very successful first year. They hired you, and then the world descended into this pandemic shutdown.
Yes.
Crap.
Yeah. Those things sort of happened at the same time. It was spring break in March, and I was in Colorado, and the chair of the music department called me and offered me the permanent position, assistant professor position, tenure track. And I said, "Oh, wow, this is so exciting. Yeah, great. You know, I did the thing you're supposed to do. I'll think about it. I'll get back to you," and all that stuff. And then like the news broke within 24 hours, everything was shutting down. Schools were canceling everything. And I said, I better sign that contract.
Yeah.
Before it gets revoked. But yeah, so I literally was offered the position, and then I haven't taught another day since then, at least not in person.
Right. I mean, it's funny. You were thinking that. They may have been thinking exactly the same thing. We've got to get him to sign that contract.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah. Well, I have a feeling that the music department and we get along really well, and they were, I think, happy to offer me the position and happy I accepted. But maybe some bean counter higher up at the university was like, if we just didn't have to pay an orchestra director for a year, that would be okay, because we might not have orchestra next year anyway. So as it turns out, we are doing face-to-face orchestra next week. So they need me, and I have the contract. So I'm going into my first year in the tenure track position. Ironically, a little bit of change of title, a little tiny bit boost in pay, but the job's exactly the same. I still teach the same classes and the same students, and my role will change. I'll just be a little bit more invested.
So you and I both grew up in Texas.
Yes.
Both became musicians and conductors. We lived in a few of the same cities.
Yeah.
We worked together in New York for Astoria Symphony.
Yeah.
For the most part. And yet we met in Sofia, Bulgaria.
Yeah.
and unless you're a conductor, that might actually sound random. But since you're still running, you're very highly successful and very long running now, almost 20 years, right? The International Conducting Institute.
Yes.
You hold workshops all over the world, including most notably the Czech Republic, and you host some of the most highly regarded conducting pedagogues in the world. And
we do, yeah. The instructors who have taught our workshops are some of the best. There are a couple of other that are some of the best that we haven't been able to get yet, but it's not for trying. It's not for lack of trying, rather. And so it's hard to count the number. So the International Conducting Institute, it used to have another name, and it happened in Czech Republic. This summer would have been the 30th anniversary. So next year, in the 31st year, we'll have the 30th anniversary workshop, I hope. But I've been organizing that workshop for 10 years. But even before 10 years ago, I was organizing workshops with some other orchestras that I worked with. And so you saw the Round Rock Symphony workshop, and you saw and assisted me with a few of those Astoria Symphony workshops. And we've held workshops in Boulder, Colorado, and and in Columbia, Missouri. We've held workshops all over the place. Finding the location and mostly finding the host orchestra, that's the hard part.
Right.
But it's really exciting. And like you said, you meet people from all over the world in the most random of places. So hard to believe that, you and I lived in the same place in New York for a while, and then again in Virginia, and we've known each other for 18 years, something like that, 17, a long time.
Yeah, a long
And
time.
all because we happened to go to the same workshop in Bulgaria. I think that's pretty incredible. And also it's a testament to how important it is for conductors, young conductors, especially students who are trying to meet people and they don't have a network. It's a lesson to them that you just have to go out and do activities, make friends with everyone. You never know who you're going to end up assisting or who's going to help you get a job one day or who you might be on a podcast with.
Right. Your career has taken you down all of these different avenues: conductor, composer, guitarist, arranger, administrator, army captain, teacher, entrepreneur, just to name a few of the most prevailing ones that actually have job titles. So where in there, let's assume that for the moment that you had to pick one. Where did you find or have you found your greatest satisfaction, both artistically and professionally?
That's really difficult to say because each thing that I've done in life has given me satisfaction in a different way. But I have to say that my time as the music director of the Astoria Symphony, that carries two glorious titles. That was my most artistically satisfying time and also my most frustrating time. Frustrating because money was always an issue. It wasn't really a paid job. It certainly wasn't a living. And there were a lot of struggles. Everything was a struggle with the Astoria Symphony. However, I had kind of complete artistic control and I was learning so fast. It's not that I was making great music, but it was at the very beginning of my career. I had very little experience. And so everything I did was very satisfying because it was the first time I conducted a Beethoven symphony in concert, the first time I conducted a Brahms symphony, the first time I commissioned a piece of music, the first time I did Firebird, the first time I conducted a whole concerto top to bottom. I did all those things as the music director of the Astoria Symphony, which I founded and got, with some other people, I got going. And so that was artistically, that was really satisfying to me. And it was good training so that when I later won a proper job that I didn't create, if someone said, well, do you know how to write grants? I was like, oh yeah, I did that with the Astoria Symphony.
You did everything.
Do you ever write program notes? Like, oh yeah, I designed every program book for 15 years. Well, do you know how to build a podium? Yeah, I built a podium.
I was going to say that.
I did everything that a conductor isn't supposed to do even for the Astoria Symphony. So yeah, that's that.
When I think of Astoria Symphony and doing all that stuff, that's the epitome of that situation. I mean, I wasn't there for all of it with you, obviously, but like lugging that goddamn podium all around Queens and to Manhattan and back. That was I was like, yeah, this is what it's like to be a conductor in New York. What is this? This is crazy. Yeah. But yeah, that thing, like, it was perfect because it never broke. It was always sturdy. It was the perfect thing. And I know you made it. And yet it weighed like a ton.
Yeah, because I didn't make it from space age materials. I made it with 2x4s. I got it at Home Depot. So obviously it wasn't light. But that's reminding me of like it was the very first concert I ever conducted with the Astoria Symphony. So it was like 2002, I guess, or fall of 2003 maybe. And I was lugging that podium down the street. I literally was like carrying it down the street. I had I was wearing my tuxedo and I had like a bag over my shoulder with the scores. I'm carrying this podium and was trying to hail a taxi and no taxi would pull over because I was carrying a podium.
No kidding.
So that was, things like that. Like, I don't do that anymore. We should, like, by the time you're my age, if you're still doing that, you're really doing something wrong, I think. But, yeah, that was something that was in New York City even. So I didn't own a car. There was no other way to do it than just lug that thing down the street. One of the fond / not so fond memories I have is that I used to carry all my supplies for rehearsal in a rolling bag. It was actually like a cart. I kind of built it out of pieces of things, but it was like a luggage rolling cart, and then it had a milk crate on top of it. And then
I remember that.
Yeah, you remember the thing. Every musician who ever played with the Astoria Symphony, and that's hundreds of freelance musicians in New York City, they all remember like that bald guy that used to roll that cart around. He had music stands and he had parts in there and he had like a video camera and he had like, sometimes he had food in there and he'd pull out sandwiches for the whole orchestra. Like I had everything in that bag. And then several years later, I wasn't living in New York anymore. And I went back and did a recording project. And a lot of the musicians were on that session. And they all looked at me and they were like, "Hey, where's the bag? You're not rolling the bag around anymore." That's not what I wanted to be known for as a conductor, but nobody ever accused me of being allergic to work. That's for sure.
You were not. You absolutely were not. Because then on top of all of that, you had other jobs. You were teaching.
I did. No, I never made a living as the conductor of the Astoria Symphony, which is ultimately what inspired me to leave New York City and seek work elsewhere. But I was always teaching. I taught little kids at a school on the Upper East Side, as you know, and I was an opera producer at the Manhattan School of Music for a couple of years, and then I was offered a job as a conductor in the Army, which was a really weird turn for me. But that was the first job that offered me a full-time paying salary to be a professional conductor. That's why I took that job.
Right. All right, let's go on to the other subject of the day besides you. Yes. So Horatio Parker, member of the Boston Six, the second New England school. So you studied him during your doctoral studies, and what was it that you had to do for it? It wasn't the document, was it?
No, it was just for my comprehensive exams.
Right.
And I never took a class on Horatio Parker, nor did I take a class on American music or none of those things. But one of my doctoral committee members is a musicologist and happens to love the first and second New England schools of music. And so for my comprehensive exams, each of the professors is supposed to ask me one question, and I've got like a whole day to answer that question in writing. And then I have to go in front of the group of them and then defend my answers. And all that happened last spring, and it went pretty well. Or it happened, a long time ago now, a spring and a half ago, or a year and a half ago. But so one professor said, "Well, I'm going to ask you about the second New England School of Composers," and I'm so grateful that she told me that, because it gave me a couple of weeks to learn everything that I could learn about it. Because if I had just been asked that as a question, I would have bombed horribly. And so that's my caveat, is that I know kind of a lot about Horatio Parker because I learned it very quickly under duress, but not because I'm a musicologist or an expert in early American music.
No, you were a resourceful doctoral student. That's why you learned it.
I am. I learned as much as you could learn in a couple of weeks. And I answered the question, and I got gold stars all the way. I won. I did a good job. So
with all of this knowledge, what can you tell us about the highs and lows of his personality, his career, and his compositional character?
Well, I know less about his personality, but a bit about his career. So he was born in the mid 1863, I think. And so that would make him sort of the same age as Debussy. And let's see, he would have been 20 years or 30 years younger than Brahms, I think. He was a little bit younger than Dvorak, but he was the same age as these late Romantic composers. I think he's the same age as Mahler, for example, and probably Puccini, a little bit younger than Verdi. But so those are his classmates. What made him special is that he was American, and there were very few famous American composers in America, and even fewer who were famous in Europe. And he was somewhat renowned in Europe, especially in England. For whatever reason, English composers really took a liking to his music. But he started as a church musician, as so many composers do and did back in the day. And he was an organist, and he was born in Massachusetts, but he got church jobs all over in New York for a while, and then New Haven, and then in Boston. And his work especially in New Haven and Boston was so impressive that he was offered a faculty position at Yale. And even without a degree, he studied a little bit. He studied with Chadwick, actually, who I think you're talking about in one of your other shows. And then he went to Germany because Chadwick said, "Oh, you've got to go study in Munich, this conservatory in Munich where I studied. That's where you'll really learn, that's where you'll learn counterpoint and all that, harmony and all that stuff that was so important back in those days for composers.
Right.
And after coming back from Europe, that was kind of all he needed to do to get to work. But he never had a degree. So funny story, Yale wanted to hire him as a music theory and composition professor, but they just had a rule that nobody could work there without a degree. So they gave him an honorary degree. Then they hired him. I don't think that would fly nowadays because you need transcripts and whatnot. But
no, it's the other way around. You need to be famous first, and then
maybe at Yale, but even at any university, they say, do you have a degree? If so, send me your transcripts. Now you get the job. But in his case, they said, "Wow, you're really great. We'd like to hire you, but you don't have a degree. So why don't we just give you a degree and then we'll hire you?" So that worked out pretty well for him. And one thing I think is kind of interesting about him, it was sort of the end of it was the 1890s. Where he was taking a train between New York, Boston, and New Haven constantly. In Philadelphia, he had founded a choral society in Philadelphia. So in the 1890s, now if you think about taking the train from New York to Philly, it's a piece of cake, $18 in 3 hours, and it's there. But I have a feeling in the 1890s, it was a little tougher. And so this would make him maybe the world's first jet-setting maestro, even in the days before jets.
Right. Wow. Yeah, that's good. And that also means, I guess, that like Chadwick, he was born long before there were trains, at least passenger trains anyway, and before there was electricity. And
it must have been coal. I imagine they were coal trains back then, and I don't think they moved as fast as the I've forgotten the name of that bullet train that goes from New York to DC every day. But they weren't. The Acela, yeah, it's not. They didn't move like the Acela. I'm sure there were a stop in every little village along the way, and so anyway, to say like, well, I've got a church gig in Boston and I teach in New Haven nowadays, that's no big deal. You can just make that happen. But in 1893, that must have been a hell of a way to make a living. But anyway, he did it.
Right.
And those are the nuts and bolts of his career, not really about his music. Regarding his music, he wrote in a German romantic fashion. In the middle part of his career, he started exploring a lot more chromaticism and different key relationships between movements and sections of pieces, a little bit like Brahms. I wouldn't say that at any point in his career he was so forward-looking that he was ahead of everyone else. Like I said, he lived at the same time as Debussy. What Debussy was doing would have been way more harmonically advanced, I think.
Right.
But for an American composer, he was like the only person in America. There were just this small group of composers in New England, which is why they're famous, who were doing this stuff. And so for that reason, he's significant as an important part of American musical history, even if most people don't know his name anymore.
Yeah, we'll get to that for sure. Yeah. So let's connect with Chadwick a little bit. So Chadwick was less than 10 years older than him, but of course Parker lists him as one of his biggest influences, compositionally anyway. And talking about the very young Parker, I found this quote by Chadwick. He says, "He was far from docile. In fact, he was impatient of the restrictions of musical form and rather rebellious of the discipline of counterpoint and fugues. His lesson usually ended with his swallowing his medicine, but with many a wry grimace." So now this says just as much about Chadwick as it does about Parker. Chadwick, of course, got this label of being very workmanlike, very the music is great. It's very well crafted. That's about it. There's no soul or something like that. Some kind of idea like that, which I don't get. I don't get that, but I wasn't alive then. So even though it shows that in that quote, is this seem like an accurate statement of the composer that Parker became, or is it maybe just a phase maybe attributable just to youth, because he was pretty young at that moment, I think, when he made that comment.
Yeah, he must have been 17-ish. Yeah. If I remember quickly, I am looking at my notes. He was 19 when he moved to Germany, so he couldn't have been older than 19 when he was studying with Chadwick. He was 17, 18, 19 years old. Obviously, teenagers, even old teenagers, like 18 and 19-year-olds, are pretty impulsive and independent and rebellious. That's just the nature of being a person. But it's also the nature of when every generation's view of the generation after them, right? I mean, every generation thinks the next bunch is a bunch of slackers. That's just the way it goes. And Haydn thought that about Beethoven, and I'm sure Schumann felt that in some way about Brahms, and for sure Chadwick felt that way about Horatio Parker. Horatio Parker then went to study in Munich with Josef Rheinberger, and ironically, I think Josef Rheinberger is like the Horatio Parker of Germany, like a really, really great composer who's kind of famous because he's in history books, but not a common name. And Horatio Parker is sort of the same. But Horatio Parker and Josef Rheinberger had this relationship in Munich as well. Teacher, student, rebellious student, didn't want to follow the rules. He kind of did his assignments begrudgingly and did a good job, but then when he wrote his own music, it wasn't like that. Well, fast forward 15, 20 years, and guess who's a student of Horatio Parker at Yale? Charles Ives. And guess what Horatio Parker said of Ives? The exact same thing. And so I don't think I'm never shocked. In fact, I would be shocked if I heard a composition teacher or mentor say of their student, no, he just does everything I tell him to do, and he loves it, and he writes music sounds just like mine, and he doesn't try any experiments. Well, that composer's not going to get anywhere.
Right. Neither is the teacher, really.
Right. Yeah, probably. Yeah. So, and by the way, this is a slightly off topic, but I think if I were a serious composer and I wanted to pick a famous composer to study with so that I could learn all I could and become a famous composer myself, I might choose some famous living composer now and go study with them and write music that sounds just like theirs, and then shoot myself in the foot essentially and not accomplish my goal.
Right.
Because a student composer has to have their own voice. And so, yeah, Horatio, let me get this straight. Chadwick or Rheinberger would have said of Horatio Parker, he's very rebellious. His music is pretty out there. He doesn't follow the rules, et cetera, et cetera. But now, looking back 100 years, 130 years, let's say, at Horatio Parker's music, it's very conservative. It sounds a lot like Brahms. And Brahms was, as I mentioned, 30 years older than Parker was.
Right. Right. Now, like you said earlier, you said that the English kind of took to Parker's music for some reason, probably because of the mass amount of choral music that he wrote, and that was still a big deal then. Now, Elgar seems to have been quite a fan, and in 1898 letter to his own publisher, he said the Ora Novissima contains more music, that's Elgar's emphasis, than any of your other Englishmen have as yet managed to knock out. Again, that says just as much about Elgar as it does about his feeling for Parker. But so despite that arrogance, what do you think he meant by that? What did he mean by his having more music than most of the other English composers at the time, anyway?
Well, before I answer that question seriously, there's the obvious joke to be made that this comment may have been more about his fellow Englishmen than about Parker. Because who are the other Englishmen we're talking about in the late 1800s? There was Elgar and there was
Butterworth,
Vaughan Williams, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, right.
Holst, maybe. Whoever else was on the roster at that publisher, they're all forgotten now. So It may have been Elgar sticking it to his publisher saying, why are you signing all these bonehead Englishmen? They're not nearly as good a composer as this guy is. But the serious answer to your question, I think what you're really asking is, what did he mean by it has more music in it? And that's a tough question to answer. He got started as a hymn writer, Parker, I mean. Mm-hmm. And there were lots of hymn writers in those days. They produced hymns by the dozens, right? Hymnals and reams of hymns. But Parker was trying to do something bigger. And I think his Hora Novissima is his maybe not most performed work, but his most famous work because of the grandeur of it. And in some way, most famous composers, they've got that one work that's like the epic. It's got the choir, it's got the soloist, it's got the whole giant. It's the Beethoven 9 or the Brahms Requiem or the you get it. It's the Mahler 2. It's the piece that's the one, and the Hora Novissima is it.
That's good.
And I think Yeah, and I think Elgar may have just been saying, like, this piece of music has got it all. Like, it's got all the bells and whistles, meaning chorus, soloists, and orchestra. And also it's just a massive piece. It's 11 movements and it's extremely well written, lots of different styles too. Like maybe that's what he was getting at, was that it wasn't all in one style. It didn't all sound like the first movement. There's a cappella moments that sound like Renaissance madrigals. There are arias that sound like they could be from Baroque opera. And there are massive choral pieces which sound like they could have been written by Mahler as well. Right. And so there is a lot of music in it, and maybe that's what he was talking about. I don't know.
You know what? Now that's interesting, because I agree with you with all of that. I don't know the piece as well as you do, but I do know it enough to know that. Now, why do you think that he chose the text that he chose, which is not exactly, I think he specifically said something about not choosing a dramatic text, and he chose one that's kind of reflective. It's kind of like, we all die, and we should repent and go to heaven, and then be better. You know, that's reductive, but still, I mean, it seems like it would have been easier to choose something with a little more drama in it that built into the story, and then to color that text would have been slightly easier to compose to. But obviously, he didn't seem to have any problem with choosing that. But why would he have chosen that text over so many others that were available?
Well, I'll take a few educated guesses. So first of all, if I didn't know anything about Parker, I would have guessed that he wanted to write his big mass, but that he wasn't religious. That's not true, because he was religious. So that's not the reason. But for example, Brahms wanted to write his big religious masterpiece, except he didn't feel that way. He wasn't that devout of a Christian. And so he wrote his German Requiem, which had texts that were religious, but they weren't really, you know, it's not an actual mass, for example.
Right.
And then you've got Carmina Burana, which came after Horatio Parker, of course, but pieces like that dive into Latin poetry and find poems that are beautiful or evocative or dirty, or, you know, like pornographic in the case of some of the Carmina Burana texts.
Right.
But I think Horatio Parker wanted to write an epic piece of choral music, like an oratorio that was not a mass, and that explored spiritual concepts, but maybe didn't want to write a cantata or a mass or an oratorio per se. That's just kind of a guess at why he would choose a text like that. Then I think the more pragmatic answer, the more practical and probably the easier answer, is that he collaborated with his mother a lot. His mother, if I remember correctly, and now your musicologist Eagle Eyes will find all my errors here, because now I'm really just guessing and recalling facts that may or may not be true. But his mother, I think, was like an English teacher or a professor of writing or something like that. And she also spoke Latin and was a linguist and a scholar of old texts in those forgotten languages. And so I think that his mother chose that as the libretto, and then sort of adapted it for him. And I may be wrong about that. I know that they collaborated, and I can't remember if they collaborated in Hora Novissima, but that may have had something to do with it too. For sure, if his mother didn't choose this and say, hey, you're thinking of writing a big oratorio, I've got just the text for you. It's this obscure Latin poetry that no one knows about except for me. You should set that. If that didn't happen, then he at least must have asked his mother for some advice, or like, I'm thinking of doing it. I found these poems. What do you think? Because they were very close. She was very intelligent, and it would have been a no-brainer.
Right. No, I think I remember that about his mother, and I'm sure that had something to do with it. It is an interesting choice. I mean, we are here talking about him for reasons not related to the fact that everyone in the world knows who he is. But
yes.
We are talking about some of his pieces that have those elements in it. They're different from everything else. And that choice of that text, I would doubt that anybody else chose that as the subject for their religious work.
Yeah,
and
I don't know.
That, it's not a thing anymore, right? It's not like you have to, if you're going to be a big time composer, you have to have a big religious work anymore. But at the time, obviously that was the case. So. But it does kind of make sense that if we're coloring his character, then if he was kind of coloring outside of the lines in that way, then he'd be like, oh yeah, nobody else knows this text really. So let's go with that.
Yeah, it could be. And he wasn't ambitious in the way that some composers wanted to have they wanted a legacy of some sort. Like, I've got to write the great opera or the great whatever so that my name will always be remembered. He wasn't like that. I think he was truthfully looking for he wanted to produce a fantastic piece of music, like a really important piece of music, and not any text will do. But on the one hand, it didn't have to be Old Testament or New Testament or a non-religious it didn't have to be Latin even. It could have been anything that spoke to him. Now, I don't know his biography so well. It would make sense that if at this time he was also maybe going through some strife or something, because the text I find actually quite dramatic. It's not dramatic like Carmina Burana, for example,
Right.
But I'll read the first couple lines of the text. The piece opens up by saying, "The world is very evil. The times are waxing late. Be sober and keep vigil. The judge is at the gate." Well, that sounds like something someone would write in 2020.
Yeah, right.
That sounds like something written in a moment of crisis. The judge that comes in mercy, the judge that comes with might, to terminate the evil, to diadem the right. I mean, that's pretty like fire and brimstone kind of stuff. I'll say this though. What I do know about his biography is this was written in 1893.
Mm-hmm.
In 1893, he had just finished working or was at the end of his time at the New York Conservatory of Music, I believe was the proper name for it, that Dvorak was the director of.
Right.
And Dvorak and he overlapped by 1 year. He was never the director of the school, but Dvorak was the director of the American Conservatory of New York, something like that. Everybody knows the story of how Dvorak came to America, lived in New York for a few years, visited Iowa, went back home, etc. Wrote his great New World Symphony. Well, the end of Dvorak's time was the beginning of Parker's time at the conservatory in New York, and they worked together. Dvorak would have been his boss for the first year he worked there. And I can't imagine these two brilliant composers not talking about music frequently. And when they talked about music, I can't imagine Dvorak not bringing up Brahms frequently. And so it's no mystery to me that this piece just reminds me of the Brahms Requiem so much. And not that he was emulating Brahms or emulating Dvorak's Te Deum for that matter, but I think in this year, 1 year after working in New York City with Dvorak, he would have said, "I'm also going to write an epic choral orchestral masterpiece." And like Dvorak and Brahms, it's going to be religious in nature, but it's not going to be a sacred text. What text can I find? And so however it happened, he found this text.
Right. Now, going a little bit sideways, Parker does have an opera titled Mona. And it premiered in 1912, so considerably later. It was premiered by the Met Opera and probably had 4 performances with the Met, and that's probably the only time that anyone in the world has heard fully produced performances of that opera. I didn't check that for sure, but it seems like that's the only time anybody ever fully put it on, was those first 4 performances. So now it does seem that, I don't know this firsthand, but it does seem that Parker has a little notability with choral music still. Why is it, do you think, that Mona didn't catch on the same way?
Well, I admit that I'm Googling something very quickly because I remember the story of this opera. And
it's essentially it's this southwest portion of England, while the Romans were occupying it, and Mona was, I can't remember his name, but she was engaged to be married to a Roman soldier, but she didn't know that he was a Roman soldier, and he was really working against the Romans and for her and this particular group of Englishmen.
I remember there was something like that.
Yeah, and in the end, she kills him. Yeah.
Oh, she killed. Okay. Well,
she kills him before finding out that he was on her side. Like secretly.
Well, that sounds like a typical opera plot to me.
Yes, that's great.
It sounds like a good story. It sounds like more or less not the same story as every opera, but it sounds like a good opera story.
Right.
And his music that I know is good enough that I can't imagine that wasn't a captivating piece of music. But there was some controversy surrounding the piece and its premiere or its production. And by controversy, I mean that opera in America at the end of the 19th century was run exclusively by Italians,
right,
or Italian Americans, but like really Italians, like recently immigrated Italians. And they didn't like music that wasn't Italian. It was, hearing a German opera was next to impossible, or a French opera. It was just Italian opera. And there was some controversy about the language, or the fact that one of the characters was Italian, but he was singing in English, or that they were all singing in Italian, but the Italian wasn't quite right. But so I'm making stuff up. But the real answer is, why didn't it stick? Well, he was born at the same time as Puccini, and not to knock Horatio Parker, I can't imagine anything he wrote was as good as anything Puccini wrote. And
right.
So the Italians who are running the Metropolitan Opera probably also recognized that. And even if his music was better than Puccini's, they would have favored Puccini as a fellow paisano, right?
Right.
I think that's the case. And I'm racking my brain to remember the story, and I wish I had looked it up before today, but there were one of those second New England School of Music, School of composers wrote an opera that was about Italian Americans immigrating, and it was an enormous flop because the people who were producing it were immigrants from Italy, and they all, like, it didn't speak to them, or they thought, this guy doesn't, he's trying to speak for us, and he doesn't know. I can't remember if that was Parker or somebody else, but that may have been even Chadwick. I just don't remember.
Actually, I think it was Parker's other opera, but of course I don't remember.
Yeah, it could have been. So yeah, for whatever reason, he was known as a church musician, and he was known as like a music theory nerd, Yale professor. And so his opera just wasn't successful, and doesn't mean it wasn't good. Right. But it did the one production and then was never heard of again. I'm sure it's still in their library, and one day they may choose to do it again, although I don't know why they would.
Of course, the vocal score is on IMSLP. Of course, who's really gonna go and like dig that up and start and learn some arias? But
well, it's making me want to look at it, because I'm curious. For example, is it even in Italian? If it is,
no, it's in English. So he wrote it. Yeah. I forget the guy's name, but he used a librettist. Actually, he used an author to do the libretto, and it was written in Old English, which even at the time was awkward. So he did it.
That's why it flopped.
Right. That was part of it. The other reason was, I think that actually, even though he released it after the opera premiered, the author released the text of the opera as a book, and that became more famous than the opera, and was praised as like, oh, well, this is a great story, so why do we need the opera? Something like that.
Well, you're making me want to look at that vocal score and check it out a little bit, because I'll bet there's really great music in there, and it sounds like a good opportunity for some student conductor to put together a production at their university, at least do some scenes or something.
Of course, what you're mentioning about the singer, I remember I think the review, or one of the reviews, said that the sopranos sang very well, but it was like singing a Wagner opera. So there was no way she was going to be able to sustain that for multiple productions. So you just got to find a Wagnerian soprano.
Soprano, sure. Well, they exist, so.
They do now, I guess.
Yeah.
At the time,
well, to be honest with you, just the opera scene at that time in New York history, I want to say in American history, but there were only a couple of opera companies. They're all in the Northeast, probably. There may have been some small opera company down south that I don't know about, or in some frontier town. But so basically, when we're talking about the American opera scene in the 1890s, we're talking about the Metropolitan Opera. That's it. And whatever else was going on in America wasn't even on the radar. So if he wrote an opera in English, that's why it failed. And if he wrote an opera in Italian, that's why it failed. It doesn't really matter what language it was in. He's an American guy writing something that wasn't, Puccini or Verdi. And so, naturally didn't do well.
Ironically, it's probably not too much different now. I mean, with the exception that, like, there are many more German operas still now performed at the Met. There's not a whole lot of, like, variation of repertoire, both in opera and in orchestral music, which is partially why we're talking about this.
And then it's a little off topic for our conversation today, but I think going forward, opera companies and orchestras, for that matter, are going to be looking for new repertoire just to this year was kind of a reset in the orchestra world, in the world. It was like here's a pause, reboot. Let's see what we can do next year. And so opera companies, I think, are going to be looking at more contemporary works and works by women and composers from demographics that were traditionally neglected. And so for that reason, I don't know that anyone will ever go back in time and find this Horatio Parker opera. I can't imagine why anyone at the Met would do that when there's all this new stuff to produce, and new.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's give them something anyway. Let's give him another piece, at least the orchestras anyway. So A Northern Ballad, which he wrote in 1899, so before that, but it's still quite at the peak of his career, is probably the only orchestral piece that's still performed with any kind of regularity. And that's kind of ironic that it's an American composer, and if anybody realizes that about him, but most of the thematic material is mostly Scottish, and it's not a Northern Ballad about North America. It's about Europe. And despite his career-long goal of establishing himself as purely American, trying to shed this German European influences, or at least in talking anyway, which I agree with you, he didn't really do it music-wise, but he did talk about it. Actually, the thing is, we're still brought up that way now as music students. We go to school and we're brought up the same way as he was, except we're not expected to go to Europe. We just brought all Europe here. And so we're still ingrained with all the best European, romantic, German mostly, and Italian, all of that repertoire, and that's what we base everything on, for better or worse. I'm not saying it's bad, because obviously it's not. I'm not going to knock on Beethoven and Brahms, but in his case, he's trying to reject it, and at the same time, he mostly sounds like it. And in this piece, it's overflowing with these similarities to Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet from the very beginning.
Right.
So is it those elements? Is it those German romanticism, European things, the Tchaikovsky, all of that stuff that is what makes this piece at least a little bit on the fringes of the orchestral canon? Or is it something else? I mean, what is it that keeps it in there?
Well, I think that's two different questions. One is, why would he write a Scottish tone poem? What inspired that? Why did he do that? How is that American? That's one part of the question. And the other question is, why is it now obscure and not performed frequently? So regarding the first half of that question, I think lots of stuff was going on in America at that time. So first of all, nationalism was kind of a prominent movement around the world. We've got... Hold on, something's happening. I don't know. The alarms were going off in the whole building, and we went downstairs. Everyone was evacuated. The fire department showed up. It stopped, and they said, you can go back in. That's all we know.
Wow. That's it. Amazing.
Yeah. I was on a roll before. I'll have to remember what I was going to say.
Something about A Northern Ballad.
I was saying
there was a lot of nationalism.
Yeah, good luck editing this back together. But I was saying, it might make a funny moment. I was saying that nationalism was a big thing in the world, because we have Grieg doing Grieg stuff and Dvorak doing Dvorak stuff, and Smetana and Sibelius, for example. And American composers were not immune to that effect. The difference being there was no strong American tradition yet.
Right.
So it wasn't like, Finnish composers were saying, I'm going to write Finnish music, and American composers are like, damn it. I don't even know what to write. I guess I'll just write, like variations on Chester. That's really the only thing we've got going. But I think American composers leaned on their family's heritage. And so you have, for example, in this time, Amy Beach writing a Gaelic symphony.
Right.
So maybe the first great American symphony was a Gaelic symphony.
Right.
Right? Crazy to think that way. But that was before, the first real American symphony might be by Charles Ives. And, his symphonies are weird.
Yeah,
You know,
they are crazy. Yeah.
And
They
the
are
other
more
thing,
American than this is. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, right. And the other thing that I remember reading about Amy Beach is that she wrote the Gaelic Symphony in part in response to Dvorak's New World Symphony, because Dvorak came to America. It was a weird and bizarre place. He met black people for the, like you can
Right.
imagine being a Czech guy in 1892. You're like, oh, I'd like to introduce you to my friend Fred or Joe, whatever. And he was like, what? Oh my God, a black person. I heard about, so that for him was very exciting, and it led to musical explorations. And then I think most conductors know this, but Dvorak said on the record, or he wrote an article, or publicly, he exclaimed, American composers need to rely on the music of Native Americans and African Americans. That's the American heritage. And first generation immigrants from Europe rebelled against that, because people like Amy Beach were like, well, I have about as much knowledge of African American spirituals as I do of any other kind of music I know nothing about. What I do know is Irish folk music, because that's what my parents taught me when I was a kid. So that's a very long explanation. But what I'm getting at is that I think he wrote his Northern Ballad just a couple years after his time in New York City working with Dvorak. He had for sure by this time met, befriended, and learned the music of Amy Beach, and probably was looking for his big expression of orchestral music that was not a choral piece. Right. And so, yeah, that Northern Ballad is a wonderful piece of music. Incidentally, Tchaikovsky came to New York City in the time that Horatio Parker lived in New York City. So it's likely that he met Tchaikovsky. If he didn't meet him, he for sure was at one of the Carnegie Hall performances of Tchaikovsky's music. And I don't remember what was performed at Carnegie Hall during that visit by Tchaikovsky, but I imagine Romeo and Juliet might have been on one of the programs.
I'm sure it was, yeah.
I mean, it must have been, because it was such a big piece of music. So, yeah, you can hear all that. You can hear that there's the flavor of Tchaikovsky, the flavor of Dvorak, a Northern European flavor, maybe a resistance to Dvorak. All that stuff is in a Northern Ballad, and so your average layperson, music lover / audience member wouldn't hear all that. But composers who kind of know their stuff, even if they've never heard of Horatio Parker and don't have the score in front of them, they would listen to a recording and be like, I totally hear that. This sounds like it might have been written by a contemporary of Dvorak or Brahms or Bruckner, for example. But man, it sounds like he's kind of copying Tchaikovsky and then immediately going like, I'm not Tchaikovsky.
Yeah, right.
So it's yeah, that was part one of your question. And part two of your question is, why is it now obscure? Which is a good question, but one could ask that about, why is any composer from the past or a piece of music by famous composer obscure? And just because it was selected out of rotation. I don't know.
I mean, it's a hard question to answer. Yeah, but I mean, it is like the only one that shows up multiple times, right? Like on recordings, and probably, though it wasn't on my radar until now, but like probably on actual programs, like orchestral programs, that it actually shows up in the repertoire.
I've never heard of a live performance of it, but when I was learning about this stuff last year, I read that, it's frequently performed on concerts, especially in the Northeast, especially in Massachusetts. And I was like, it is? I don't know. I mean, I've never lived in Boston. I wouldn't know if it's every 10 years it ends up on the Boston Symphony program. But I did take note of the fact there's only one recording that I know of, and there may be more, but the famous recording is by the Albany Symphony. And Albany's in that area, right? Like, it's in New York, but it's closer. Albany's closer to Massachusetts than it is to New York City, geographically, I mean, and probably culturally too. So yeah, I mean, he's definitely like an upstate New York / North. Well, he's one of the New England school of composers, and there it is.
So now this is all building to the toughest question of all, maybe unanswerable, certainly unanswerable, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So
great.
Yeah, as with all the other composers we explore on this show, Horatio Parker is definitely not a well-known person composer, whatever.
No.
And yet there's no doubt that the music is superb. It's well constructed. It's dynamic. I mean, it's got all of the things that we would want, whether it's reflective of Germanic music, European, late Romantic, whatever. It's still great music. So why might it have slipped into oblivion? Why might he have slipped into oblivion? I mean, aren't we taught that time dispenses with the bad stuff and keeps the good stuff? Does this really have something? I guess there's one theory that this has something to do with that very famous student he had at Yale who became famous, and then everybody forgets about whoever came before him.
Yes.
But so do you think that that's reasonable, or is that just a convenient excuse?
Well, that is, as you mentioned, an impossible question to answer, because we could ask it of Horatio Parker or any of several hundred other composers and living composers now, that we wonder, is this person going to be known 20 years, 100 years from now? We have no idea.
Right.
And it would be difficult to name who's the most famous living composer today. Maybe the most successful living composer, we could say, you could drop a name and say like John Adams, or, I mean, I don't know who it is.
Probably it's John Williams, right? And that's like
right.
a strange
it could be John Williams, who
hybrid,
in classical music circles is dismissed. Right. But okay, so let's say it's John Williams. 100 years from now, will we be hearing John Williams music performed? I mean, maybe at film festivals, yeah. In
Right.
movies, probably still hear it, but will we hear it in concert? And I don't know. But okay, so here's what I think about Horatio Parker. I think he was a fantastic composer, extremely talented, perhaps even a genius, and he wrote a few pieces that stand out. Hora Novissima is the real standout piece. Northern Ballad is the most performed, but I think it has as much to do with its reasonable instrumentation and its duration than anything, and performability. It's not easy, but it's not impossibly difficult. It's for what is it? Triple winds, I guess. Well, it's double winds with an English horn and an extra and a piccolo. 4 horns, 2 trumpets, 3 so it's for a reasonable, it's like a Brahms size orchestra, let's say.
Right.
And it's 12, 13, 14 minutes long. And so any orchestra, like a good youth orchestra or a mediocre professional orchestra or a fantastic professional orchestra, can play this piece, and it makes a great concert opener, especially on a themed concert like American music, or like honoring our forefathers who came from Europe, or for whatever reason. If you wanted to make a theme, it'd be very easy to include this piece. And so that's why I think it still gets programmed, or could be programmed. And I think it's a swell piece. I'd love to conduct it one day, but I have a long list of pieces I want to conduct, and it's not at
Right.
the top. It's just not at the top, not because of its merit, but just because there's other pieces I would rather hear. But here's the thing about Horatio Parker. Apart from being a mentor to Charles Ives for a couple of years, he doesn't really have any historical significance. He didn't alter. I mean, maybe if he hadn't been Charles Ives' teacher, we wouldn't have Charles Ives, and then we wouldn't have, American modernism, and then we wouldn't have gotten Philip Glass. I don't know. Maybe like that's the butterfly effect, right? We'd be in this other universe where like Biff owns a casino, and
Right.
you know what I'm saying? Like if Horatio Parker was never born, would Charles Ives even have, like, would we even have automobiles now? I don't know. but probably Horatio Parker didn't have any real major impact on American musical history. And he wasn't so prolific that he produced a whole pile of amazing pieces of music that someone could hold up as canon, right? There's like 10 orchestral pieces, and one of them is performed every 20 years by the Albany Symphony. That's not significant. And Hora Novissima is amazing and would be performed more if it didn't require an enormous choir and an enormous orchestra. And also, if I had an enormous choir and an enormous orchestra, would I perform it? No, I do the Verdi Requiem, or I would do, Mahler 2. I do something else.
I mean, in that case, you're talking about at least a year of preparation, if not more, just from the perspective of not only the orchestra, not so much, but like definitely the choir. The choir has to like plan 2 years ahead of time to say, oh, we're going to work on this piece. That's a whole year. That's the year right there.
And not to make it about pleasing the wrong audience, but performing arts organizations have to serve their board of directors and their community. And If I were really excited about Hora Novissima, which I generally am, I think it's a great piece of music and I'd love to conduct it one day. If someone else produces it and hires me, I'll do it. But if I have to produce it and I have to sell it to my board of directors and sell it to the choir members and everything, is it really the right piece of music to perform for this audience at this occasion? And is it going to make money and all that stuff? Those are all questions that performing arts organizations ask themselves all the time.
Right.
And so I might say, next year, I'd really like to do this piece. It's important for these reasons. And so let's do it. And the whole board of directors goes, Horatio Parker, never heard of him. Can't we just do the Verdi Requiem again? Or like a in-concert version of La Boheme, or,
And how do you argue with that?
Really,
Right.
Or anything else. Could we just do anything besides this piece? I never heard of it. And so maybe that's why Horatio Parker fell to the wayside. He didn't prove to be enough of a force in American musical history to be even Amy Beach. I think Amy Beach overshadowed him for sure. Maybe in part because she's a woman. I don't know. But Chadwick too. Who knows who Chadwick is, or Arthur Foote? I mean, nobody knows these names except musicologists and me and you.
Right. Well, I'm going to inform, all 20 people that listened to my show. So
well,
you'll 20 more people
in the pudding. If 5 years from now you're hearing performances of these, the New England Six and orchestras all over America, you'll know it was all because of this podcast that revival happened. But it's possible. There's a movement alive right now in America to perform more American music, and I think generally people are thinking of new music. And music by composers who are alive, so they're not thinking of Horatio Parker. But I could see a time 20 years from now when someone somewhere goes digging, or a major orchestra like Chicago or New York or Boston, more likely, does like a cycle of pieces by these composers, or there's a new recording that comes out. I mean, all it takes is BSO putting out a recording of some contemporary American music, and one of the the B side is this Northern Ballad, and then every orchestra in the world is playing it again.
Right.
By the way, it's on IMSLP. It's free. Any orchestra can play that. Like any university orchestra director tomorrow can print these parts out and put it on the stands of their musicians, and even mediocre university orchestra can play this piece.
Right.
So, maybe this is what I'll do next week if I have the right. I won't have a large enough orchestra really, but I might do this piece with my university orchestra in the future. Who knows?
Well, there you go. It's already a success.
Yeah. So there it is. All the questions answered.
There they are. Well, thank you, Maestro, for talking about this today.
Thank you for asking me. And by the way, it's nice to see you again, because we haven't we've talked on the phone once or twice in the last few months, but it's just nice to see your face again.
Yeah, it's been. That's the nature of the business, right? I mean, we're like very small community, and yet we hardly ever see each other in person.
In general, but specifically when you make friends with someone because you live in the same place,
right.
And in our case, you lived in the same place twice and spent a little bit of time together, and then we're separated by work, and family took us in different places, and so it's just it's nice to reconvene with friends. And if there's one, there are a lot of pros to go with every con, and so obviously COVID-19 is a horrible thing and it's a big bad thing, but there are a couple of positives coming out of it, and one of them is that we've been forced to do our meetings online, and that has made it easier to visit with old friends.
Right.
So there's that.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for coming on. And,
my pleasure. It was really great.
And so you're going to stream some of this stuff, that these first performances? Is that what I saw? From Washburn?
At Washburn University. Well, our first concert of the year is canceled, and so our second concert we're planning to live stream. If we make it that far, which is somewhat likely, then we'll live stream those concerts. And then just today we had a faculty meeting where a faculty member informed me about a theater in town that is looking to do online events and is willing to produce them. And so I'm going to talk to them, and I might have multiple things. But for sure, anyone of your audience that is interested can just find me on Facebook, Silas Nathaniel Huff, or my website. I'm Silas Huff. I think I'm the only Silas Huff alive right now.
I think so. Yeah.
I'm certainly the only Silas Nathaniel Huff.
That's for sure.
My website's easy to find, and if you can find that, you can find my calendar, and I put links to all my events on there. So Yeah.
All right. Well, there you have it. Well, thank you, sir, and I'm sure we'll have you back.
Thanks, Grant. It's nice to chat with you again.
Another one. You too. Thanks a
Yeah.
lot. And I'll
Bye.
see you soon. If you like what you have heard and want to support the advocacy of American orchestral music, please consider signing up to donate regularly at patreon.com for our continued production of this podcast. Also, subscribe for updates wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss an episode.